Welcome back to day 6 of the Lotte sew along, and today is the final day for construction. So you're going to need your constructed body and your constructed hood or cowl. I have my bodice wrong side out and my hood right side out. Now your hood or your cowl should have your placement notches, your center notch, and that's going to be lined up with the center notch on the front of your bodice. You also have your back notch and your side seams. So what we're going to do is I'm going to have my hood upside down with the opening facing up towards me, and then I'm going to tuck it into the neck opening of the bodice. And then I'm going to line up my notches. So that center front notch is going to be lined up with the center front notch of my bodice, and we will clip that in place. The center back seam of the hood will be aligned with the back notch of the bodice. And then our shoulder seam will be aligned with the notch on that side, making sure that your shoulder seam is pointed towards the back. And then we will repeat the other side of the shoulder, matching it up with the last notch, making sure our shoulder seam is again pointed towards the back. And now I'm going to go in and fill in clips in between my already clipped points, making sure that all my layers are not rolled and are even with each other. Before you sew this on, double check that your hood opening is pointed up towards the front of your bodice. We're over at our machine, and we can either serge or stretch stitch our hood onto our bodice. We are going to use a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Personal preference on where you want to start sewing on your hood. I prefer to start at one of the shoulder seams and making sure it doesn't shift. And then we're going to work our way around the entire hood, making sure we're not stretching anything. And again, we're using a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance with either your serger or your stretch stitch. Now, once you get all the way around, if you are not using a serger, you can go ahead and go back in and finish off your seam with a zigzag stitch over the edge. Now, because I'm using a serger and we serged in the round, I need to finish off the tail. I need to tuck the tail into my seam. I'm just using a large needle with a blunt edge, and I'm just tucking that in, and then I will go back and tuck it back in the other way, and I'm doing this under my serged stitches in between my seam. Now, if you are using a stretch stitch and you haven't finished off your edge, go ahead and zigzag around your raw edges of your hood opening to finish yours off. Set your bodice aside and grab your cuffs. I am doing just the classic cuffs, and grab your waistband. So I'm going to start with the waistband, and I'm going to fold it in half and match my short sides, right sides together, and I'm going to pin that in place. Now you don't need to stretch anything. It's just going to lay right on top of each other, and we're just pinning it in place. Now you can set that aside and grab your cuffs. Again, these are the classic cuffs, and I'm going to fold it in half, right sides together with the long sides touching, and I'm going to pin that in place all the way down the long side, not stretching anything, and then you're going to repeat that with your other cuff. We're at our machine and we need to sew our seam of our waistband and our cuffs using a stretch stitch or your serger and a 1/4 inch seam allowance. We need to sew the seams of the 2 cuffs and the waistband. Again, I'm doing the classic cuffs, and if you're using a stretch stitch, completely optional if you want to finish off the edge of your seam, because these will be on the inside. You won't see the seams. It'll just keep everything nice and neat. Your cuffs and waistband have been sewn together. We now need to fold them in half. Starting with my waistband, I'm going to finger press my seam towards one side. And then I'm going to fold it in half so that the seam meets, and I'm going to pin that. And then I'm going to work my way down the waistband, pinning the raw edges together so that they're aligned, working my way all the way around the waistband. For the cuffs, I like to actually press the seam towards one side with my iron so that way it stays put when I go to fold my cuff so I can turn it right sides out. So I will match my seams of the cuff. So I'm folding it in half, matching the seams and pinning that in place. I do have the seams going in the same direction. And then I tuck my fingers in and hold the seam down while I turn it so that my seam doesn't shift. And when it's all turned out, the seam is going in the same direction. And then I'm going to repeat the same thing for my other cuff. With our sleeve wrong side out, right sides together, we're going to lay our seam towards one side. And then we are going to grab one of our cuffs, and with the folded edge, you're going to tuck that into your sleeve, matching up your seam of your cuff with the seam of your sleeve. I do like to offset it with the seam of the sleeve going in one direction and the seam on the cuff going the other direction. And then you'll match your notches, your notch on the opposite side of the cuff with the notch on your sleeve, and pin that in place, and you'll work your way around. Now you will notice that the cuff, you will have to stretch a little bit to get it to fit. You want that. Just make sure that stretch is evenly distributed around the cuff. And you'll repeat this with your other cuff. This is what you'll have when you have your cuffs pinned on. We now need to pin our waistband on. Grab your waistband and turn your bodice upside down, and we are going to pin the waistband on. The instructions say to pin the seam towards the left side. Honestly, you can pin it to either the left or the right side. I don't really think it matters. So you're going to take and have your folded edge is going to be tucked into your bodice. And you're going to line up the seam of the waistband with one of your side seams. And again, I will have the seam of the bodice going one way and the seam of the waistband going in another way. And I'm going to butt that up against each other. And then I'm going to go through and match up my notches, making sure that all my layers are being pinned and are even with the edges. Making sure nothing is rolled in, especially in your pocket area. That area likes to roll. So you're going to match all your notches. So you have 2 notches on that front pocket panel. And then you have a side notch on your waistband. And you have 2 notches in the back. So I matched the side seam, the front 2 notches, the back 2 notches, and then I went back in and did the last side notch. Once you have all your notches and sides pinned, you can go back in, and just like the cuffs, you're going to have to evenly distribute the stretch in between your notch marks. Your waistband has been pinned and your 2 cuffs have been pinned. We now need to go and sew these on. Back at the machine, I like to start with the waistband just because it's a wider opening, so it's just easier to sew. Using a 1/4 inch seam allowance and either your serger or your stretch stitch. I also like to start when I'm sewing the waistband, I'll start near my seam of my waistband and then I'll sew around. Make sure that your stretch is evenly distributed around your waistband. You will have to kind of snugly hold, I guess you could say, the waistband. Don't stretch your bodice. You're only kind of stretching your waistband as you sew so that it lays flat with your bodice. If you are using a stretch stitch, make sure that you go back in and zigzag over the edge to finish your seam off. Now we need to sew our 2 cuffs on. So again, we're using a stretch stitch or a serger and a 1/4 inch seam allowance. You will have to kind of stretch your cuff to get it on and under the needle. It is a tight space, so just be patient with it. I do like to start at the seam of the cuff to get that held in place, and then I'll work my way around. Again, just like the waistband, you will have to kind of stretch as you sew. You're not stretching the sleeve, you're kind of stretching the cuff to keep it evenly distributed and flat with the sleeve. So do that to both your sleeves, and if you are using a stretch stitch, go back around and do your zigzag to finish off your edge. You now have your sleeves and your cuffs sewn on. So if you did use your serger, you will need to tuck your tails, just like we did with the hood, because we did sew these in the round. If you didn't finish off your seams with your stretch stitch, go ahead and go back in and zigzag over the edges of your cuffs and your waistband to finish off your seams. And then you're done. I do like to try it on, and I will cut my drawstrings. If they are too long to my liking, I'll trim those up and get those finished off. So I tried it on, marked where I wanted to cut my drawstrings because I already knew they were going to be too long. So I'm going to cut my drawstrings, and then I'm going to, I don't have any hardware for the ends of my drawstrings, so I'm just going to tie it in a knot right up to the end, pull it pretty snug, and then you can trim that end if it's a little too long. Again, before I cut my drawstrings, I did try it on, and I marked where I wanted my drawstrings to fall. You did it. You sewed the Lotte hoodie from Sinclair Patterns, and I can't wait to see your finished results. Remember to post your photo for day 6 in the corresponding day on the Fandea Fabric Sew Along group.